You ever feel like that bottle and God's Spirit's trying to get in and just like, where did it go?
Yeah.
Doing good jobs. We are looking at these different 52 stories over this course this year that lay the foundation for our faith. And we're looking at the story of Joseph today, and it's sort of a long story. It's in Genesis 37 to 47, at least the part of Joseph's story that we're going to be looking at. Don't worry, we're not going to cover at least reading it all today. We read verses 1 through 5 earlier. We're going to read a little bit more here in a minute. I don't know how you feel when it comes to the stories in the Bible, but there seems to always be more to the story than the ones when you just sort of learned them in Sunday school, or you kind of get the gist of it. The more you read it for yourself, you man, there's so much more in here that I can learn from as an adult. And to understand a story best, you kind of have to go back to the beginning. And this story that we're looking at today begins with Jacob. Jacob was Joseph's father, who by the time that this story is sort of being told, Jacob already has a nickname. His nickname is Israel. We get Israel from it. It's a Hebrew term, or name, that simply means to contend with God or to wrestle with God. If you always wonder what Israel meant, that's what it means. The El is the God part, Israel is to wrestle with. This Hebrew name, and that's a whole other story how he got the nickname. It's in the 32nd chapter. It's a great story, but it's not one of these 42 that we're looking at. In fact, there are a lot of great stories about Jacob that we're sort of skipping over, like the one about how Jacob was tricked and he ends up with 2 wives instead of 1 wife. But we're going to look at those stories maybe at another time and learn the lessons from them. Israel, Jacob's nickname, also became the name that was used to refer to Jacob's offspring as they grew in number, and it also refers to the nation that family would eventually become. You may not realize this unless you're looking up with one of those Bible apps, is that the word Israel appears 2,431 times in the Bible. It appears in 34 of the 39 books of the Old Testament. It appears in 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. It's clearly an important name. Most of us recognize it when we hear it. The reason that Israel is probably the most significant name in the Bible, apart from those that refer to God, whether Father, Son, or Holy Spirit, is that Israel were the descendants through whom God's promise to Abraham to redeem all people was kept. They were God's chosen people for this purpose. And so their story essentially becomes our story. Their history becomes our history. For as the Apostle Paul said, those who were redeemed by Jesus, the real or true Israel, we become that as we accept Jesus as the Messiah, as we call him the Christ. And he's the one who, through these promises of redemption, is kept in our own lives. Now, before Israel becomes this nation of chosen people, they were simply a family living in the promised land, in Canaan. Jacob was the son of Isaac, and we learned that Jacob, Israel, had these 12 sons. He also had a daughter, which doesn't get much press, so there were 13 children in all. It really was a big family. Most of us don't have families like that anymore, but it wasn't too long ago until it was fairly common. My grandfather was one of 12. And man, there are all kinds of family stories about dynamics between the kids. To complicate things in Jacob's family is that his children were not all from the same women. He had children by 4 different women. 2 from his wives and 2 from their servants, who their wives had given to him whenever they were barren, so to make sure that he really would have children to keep the promise of God. It wasn't exactly sort of God's plan. They're sort of trying to preempt it. But eventually, all of them would bear him children. As you might imagine, in a family like that, they didn't end up blending very well. It definitely a blended family, but it was more like, man, we should need to get something else going on here. And it might be the reason that these siblings, and siblings sometimes have a hard time getting along anyway, had even more difficulty. This part of their story that we're looking at today begins when the next to the youngest of these siblings, Joseph, who we find out, as we've been talking about, was also Jacob's favorite son, who was born to his favorite wife. He was only 17 years old, we're told in the story. His older brothers recognized that he really was their father's favorite son, and it just makes no bare bones about it. They hated him for it. I don't know if you know someone who's kind of the golden boy. They can do no wrong, it seems like. And they get away with everything, and you're going like, I get in trouble for brushing my teeth. Everything I do is wrong, and everything they do is perfect, and you kind of build a resentment toward them. They were so upset, the scriptures tells us, that they couldn't even talk civilly to them. Have you ever been upset with someone like that? I would like to say that's only in the world, but I'll be honest, when I first came to this congregation, there were people who were so upset with one another, they couldn't walk down our hallway at the same time. They'd see each other and they would avoid each other. They wouldn't talk to one another because they couldn't be civil to one another. You see, this is a story that brings up issues that kind of hit close to home. It was not a healthy family. I Googled, I am so angry at my brother that I can't talk civilly to him. I was expecting something to pop up about Joseph and his brothers, and it didn't come up. But man, there were a lot of stories I found, just hit after hit after hit, who were people who were upset with their brother, and most of them wanted to know, when is it okay for me to stop talking to my brother? When is it okay to draw the line and be done with them? Each person explained their situation, and I'll be honest, some of them were just truly off. And I was just sort of sad about reading it. It seems that our modern society, that this sort of cutting off your siblings is pretty common. It might even be going on in your own life. Joseph's brothers' attitude toward him did not improve whenever Joseph reported to their father that when they were out taking care of the sheep, that they were not on their best behavior. We'd call that tattling, especially if it came from one of the youngest today. And I don't know how you grew up, but I grew up believing that it was not okay to tattle. That was wrong. You just didn't do that. And not only did he tattle, but he tattled to his father, and they knew that they were going to get in trouble for not living the way their father wanted them to live. What really was the problem is these brothers didn't like being exposed. But exposing less than best behavior, isn't that exactly what Jesus does? Jesus told his disciples once, the world hates me because I testify that its deeds are evil. Kind of sounds like tattletale. That's John 7:7. When Jesus exposed your deeds as evil, and I'll be honest, if he hasn't already done that, he's going to. If he hasn't done that, whenever Jesus exposed the stuff that you're doing that you weren't really living right, did you say, oh, thank you, Jesus. I am so glad that you shined your light into my darkness. I really am thankful that you let me know that the way I'm living is wrong. And I'm really out of step. I thank you. Or were you upset that your deeds were exposed? Were you angry at Jesus for telling you that what you were doing was wrong? Did you begin to argue with Jesus, saying, who are you to tell me what's right and wrong? You see, whenever our deeds are exposed as evil, that whole Adam and Eve rebellion thing in the garden tends to rise up in our lives. Another thing that these brothers didn't like is that their father had made Joseph this special tunic, this special robe. The word that is used to describe that robe literally meant many hands. They used hands and feet to measure things. It was the breadth of the hand or the length of the foot of the sole. And so they measured stuff. And it's really a word that just means many breadths. And you'll notice in the NIV that was read earlier, it didn't say multicolored. This word only shows up 5 times in the Bible. 3 times of these are used to describe Joseph's robe. The other 2 are used to describe Tamar's robe. She's someone we'll hear about later. Her robe, when it's translated into English, is always translated, even though it's the same word, as long-sleeved. But whenever it gets to Joseph's robes, at least the older English translations, it's always many-colored, or ornate, I think is the way NIV had it today. I've never heard a good explanation why the different translations in English don't line up using the exact same word. It makes sense to me that you would translate the same word sort of in the same way. These robes were either many-colored, or they were long-sleeved, or they were ornate. Whatever it was, this many hands meant. What was certain is that Joseph's brothers, when they saw him wearing it, it reminded them that his dad, their dad, loved him best. That's what it symbolized to him, whatever it looked like. They couldn't see it any other way. They saw Joseph, they saw him wearing that jacket, and they thought, Dad really does love him better. And they hated him for it. Their jealousy always erupted. It's been pointed out to me that Israel, Jacob, was not really following best practices for raising God's children God's way by picking favorites and giving gifts to one and not the other. It really isn't a parenting model that you ought to follow. I had a neighbor next door to me who gave us a book on raising siblings without rivalry. It had a lot of good ideas in it of, how do you kind of keep the sibling rivalry stuff down to a minimum? Because we really don't want our children to fight with each other. But we learned in this story that instead of things getting better between this family, things get worse. And part of the reason they get worse is that Joseph and his brothers come together, and Joseph shares with them a dream that God has given him, right? I want you to hear this part of the story as it's recorded in Genesis. So this is, if you're in the 37th chapter, it's verses 6 through 11. And I'm going to read that part for you. And I'm going to read it from the New American Standard Version. He, being Joseph, it begins in verse 6, he said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up, and it stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it, and they bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brothers said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers and said, "Well, I've had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you've had?" This is Jacob talking. "Shall I, your mother, and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you to the ground?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Now Joseph may have simply and innocently wanted his brothers to know about this dream which God had given him. But his brothers saw his sharing with them this dream about them bowing down to him as a narcissistic desire of an arrogant, entitled brat who didn't deserve the favor that their father had bestowed on him, and who didn't obviously know his place in family. And sharing it with them had only accomplished that his brothers were more upset with him. Now there's a part of me that would like to believe that these brothers were trying their best not to lose their cool. But then Joseph had this second dream. And he shared it not only with them, but with their father. And in it, they all, including their father and mother, do bow down to him. And I think they kind of got enough is enough. We've had it. Joseph evidently must have taken this idea. Whenever he rebukes his son, it seems to be that he's telling his son, "Hey, son, yes, I like you the most. You are my favorite, but you're just taking this a little bit too far." As expected, his brothers just hate him, and his father doesn't like it either. And I'll be honest, one of the lessons we have to learn in here is it's hard to accept that God's plan might involve him raising someone else up, maybe even someone younger than us up, to use instead of us. We don't like that, because when we look at ourselves, we're like, hey, God, I'm kind of it. I'm the perfect one. You got to be using me. I'm here. And you're using this other person. Do you know who you're using? God, come on. Better material. We get jealous. We don't like it. I tell you, God can use a lot of people at the same time. It's really okay. He can do that. We learn that Israel rebukes Joseph over it. And I am sure that the other brothers notice. They see Dad putting Joseph down, and they're probably thinking, I can't wait till my turn. Man, when we get him alone, we are going to just emphasize what Dad just did, and we are going to let him know that he has not been acting as he should, and he's been arrogant, and he's been proud, and we're really going to put him in his place, just like Dad did. But interestingly, we're not told in verse 11 that Joseph's brothers' anger grew. Instead, we are told that they were even more jealous of him, even after all of this happened. We're told that it was deeper than ever, and I think they grew jealous because deep down, every one of these brothers wanted to be that one that would be raised up. They wanted to be the one who would be in charge. They wanted to be the one who's got the favor would be in. They wanted to be the one who would rule over everyone else. They had it bad. The brothers' solution for not letting things boil over was simply to put a little distance between them and Joseph. Have you ever heard that kind of advice? Man, you're angry with them? Just put a little distance. Go for a walk. Go somewhere else. Get away from that person. It's all going to be better. So that's what they do. These very upset, very jealous brothers, very angry, get the flocks, they take off to take them, and they leave Joseph behind. And at least the way the story unfolds, you kind of get the idea that he's not really interested in being with them either. Jacob sees his son kind of milling around, and he comes to him. It's almost like he's sort of feeling a little bit lost. All the air's been taken out. He's probably wondering where his place really is. And Jacob, I think, trying to do something good, comes to him and he says, hey, you know, your brothers, they've taken the flocks over to Shechem. And I want you to go. And I want you to go be with your brothers. And this is what I want you to do. I want you to go and check on their welfare and check on the welfare of the flocks. That's all I want you to do. Just go check on them. I found it interesting when I was going through this story that the word translated welfare is the word shalom. You've probably heard that word before. It's the Hebrew word for peace. Jacob was sending Joseph to check on these angry brothers to see if they were at peace and to see if the flocks they were tending were at peace. Interesting. But we know that they were not at peace, were they? They were still so incensed, even though there was distance, that they had come up with a plan that the next time they saw Joseph, they were going to do something that they thought would bring them peace. They were putting a plan together to kill him. And they really believed that killing him was going to bring peace to their lives. The world's way of settling things never brings peace. I had experience at a church a long time ago. I was down in Artesia where we were going out calling on a family. We had a family that showed up at the church, and we were going to go see them. They'd given us directions. It was sort of outside of town, a little south, and so we were kind of going out in this area. Not many places out there at that time. We were a little mixed up in our directions, couldn't find it, and so we would just stop at this mobile home that's out here. There's only a few places out here. They'll know where these people live at. I'm one of those guys that stops and asks for directions sometimes. And so we pulled in, we get out, and before we even get up to the little deck that they had in front of the mobile home, this woman came out and she says, I'm so glad you guys are here. You need to go talk to my husband. He's out by the bar. And we're looking at each other like, sure, we'll go do that. And so we go out toward this sort of a metal building of a barn kind of a thing out there. We're kind of in a distance. And we go out there, we can see he made a little fire and he's kind of circling around the fire. We can tell that he's talking to himself, don't have any idea what he's saying. We get a little closer and we can hear what he's saying. And what he's saying is, I'm going to kill her. And he's got this knife and he's throwing it into the ground and he's picking it back up and he's throwing it into the ground and he's saying over and over, I'm going to kill her, I'm going to kill her. There's going to be no peace in my life until I kill her. And we're going like, what are we getting ourselves into? And walking my friend John, we're getting closer. He finally sees us and we're not sure how he's going to respond. But we keep going closer. And of course, this is when John's going like, hey, you're the preacher. This is your territory. You go forward. Do your preacher thing. And I'm going like, I don't know what to say. What do you say? And so I get a little closer to him. And it was disturbing. And the first thing he says to us is, I knew you'd come. Because God doesn't want me to do what I need to do. And of course, we're thinking, well, we're just looking for directions. We didn't know we were coming. But God does know what we need. And he does bring the help that we need. So I started talking to this guy. Did I mention that he smelled like alcohol? I mean, like reeked with alcohol. And so I started talking to him. You know, you get trained for these kinds of things, and you hear him saying he wanted to kill her, and he repeats what he says. He says, I knew you'd come because I want to kill my wife, and I'm ready to do it. So you say, kind of assess the situation. Does he have a plan? Does he have the materials for the plan? Is he going to really carry out this plan? All these things you're supposed to do in crisis counseling, and I've been trained for that, so I'm kind of going through all these steps, trying to figure out who he is and what he's doing. What I find out is that he's ex-operations in the Army. He's already made all the surveillances. He's got a plan. What we find out is first of all, the woman in the trailer is not the wife he's talking about, but it was his ex-wife who lives in town, who's been making his life what he thinks is miserable. He has a plan. He's this ex-special forces, and whenever he was serving in the Army, his job was to go behind the lines and to take out the enemy and get back. That's what he did. He's trained. He has his truck loaded up with all the equipment he's going to need to carry out his plan to kill his wife. And he is ready to go. And he was about ready to once he got through there, to get himself and get there. What do you say to someone whose life like that has absolutely no peace? I tried to tell him, if you kill her, you're going to get caught. You're going to go to jail. You're going to be miserable. You're not going to have any peace. And he said, I work at the jail. I'm the jailer for the police force. And I'm going to have more peace sitting in jail with her dead than I'll ever have free with her alive. What do you say? I just start trying everything. And he has an answer for everything. I didn't mention the alcohol. I finally just sort of stood up to him, kind of looked up. He's this big guy. And I finally had something that came to me, and I said, you're right. There's going to be absolutely no peace in your life until blood flows. But it's not your blood, and it's not her blood. It's Jesus' blood on the cross. And it's already flowed, and it's going to establish peace in your life, the kind of peace that you're longing for. We've been studying Colossians, and we just studied that first chapter where the 20th verse says that exact same thing. And I think the Spirit brought it to mind at that moment for me to say. And it was just like you hear about in the movies. He actually dropped down to his knees, and he dropped his knives, and he looked at me, and he said, I need that peace in my life. And so we started talking about what it means to give your life to Christ. At the end of it, he said, I'm ready to be baptized. I want to do that right now. And of course, there was a part of me that's thinking, I don't think you're going to even remember our conversation tomorrow. You seem pretty wasted. So I gave him to say, hey, let's do this tomorrow. And he says, I've got a second job because of the rotation. I work at a convenience store tomorrow. Let's meet after work. And so we met after work. He remembered everything word down to detail. And he gave his life to Christ. He was baptized into Christ. He gave peace. Now, later that night when we left him, we did secure everything. We got him back in the house. We made sure that he wasn't going to be able to carry out his plans. So we did those kinds of things as well. But he did. He started changing his life, and he got peace in it. And it was amazing to see what God could do. But that's not how it went for Joseph's brothers. When Joseph arrived, where they were supposed to be tending sheep, there wasn't anyone around. And it says that someone shows up and they say, hey, you looking for your brothers? You seem lost out here. And you're like, yeah. And he goes, well, this is where they are. So he goes and he finds where they are and he follows them. And as he's coming up to where his brothers are now, verse 19 says, they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast has devoured him. And then let us see what will become of his dreams. But some of them sort of had second thoughts. In the end, they weren't all in total agreement on his plan to kill their brother. But they didn't get together about it. There's miscommunication. He gets thrown in the pit. Some of them pull him out. They get sold to some Median travelers, sell him into slavery, or take him down to Egypt. The others are going like, what are you doing? Dad's going to go nuts when we show up and he's not around. But it ends up that's what happened. They do like anyone does when you've screwed up. They cover their tracks. They take one of the animals, they kill it, they pour the blood on that robe that their dad would definitely make, and they lie about it. Yeah, that wild animal killed me. You don't know what happens. There's so many lessons to learn from a story like this. God's ability to accomplish his plans for broken people. I want to point out that his brothers were not forced by God to hate him for God to carry out his plans. God let them choose what they wanted to do, which was hate, and then God used them in what they wanted to do to further his own plans to save them. Interesting. Kind of sounds like what happened to Jesus. He used those Pharisees' hate against Jesus to let something happen to his son so that he could save them. God's ability to orchestrate things, it's amazing. We learn from Joseph's perspective how God can bring about good things from every situation, even those that are meant to cause you harm. We learn how repentance and forgiveness are a whole lot better than jealousy and revenge and deceit. Especially as this story continues to unfold. I'm like, it's just a long story. I mean, I want to encourage you to take some extra time and read it for yourself, these 37 through 47 chapters in Genesis. It's going to take a little bit of time. You'll have to dedicate some to it. I did that this last week, and it was encouraging. We learn that Joseph's story is the one that explains when and why Israel left the promised land, Canaan, and ends up living as slaves in Egypt. It really is a long story. It's not one, like I said, I'm going to read to you this morning. But I do want to sort of summarize just a little bit of it for you. While a slave, Joseph becomes respected in Egypt because of his integrity, because of his industry, because of his management skills. He stays faithful to God, even in the worst of circumstances when maybe someone else might lash out at God. His unswerving faithfulness is what gets him in trouble. He gets blamed for something he didn't do and ends up in jail, which is a great story to get into on its own. He finds favor among those running the jail because of these same qualities in his life. his reputation grows and he becomes known as someone who can interpret God's dreams. You can imagine. And it lands him an interview with Pharaoh that lands him a job offer that ends up fulfilling those dreams of his youth. His family does get reunited. They do come down to Egypt. They do end up bowing down before him. And they would forgive one another. But like everyone else in Egypt at that time, even though they're blessed by God and they're given land by God, there's still this hardship. And they end up selling everything they have just to get by and survive. And when they have nothing else left to sell, they sell themselves into slavery. It's their choice. It didn't happen to them. But they were just trying to survive. In order for us to hear God's offer of redemption as good news, we have to accept the bad news. You know, Israel, when they went down to Egypt, they didn't plan on being enslaved. That wasn't their goal. That wasn't their hope. That wasn't what they were looking for. They were just doing what they needed to do to get by, to try to have enough to eat. Heard stories like that of people who sort of get enslaved, just trying to survive. People are still making slaves of themselves today in a great variety of ways, thinking that it'll just help them get through, that it'll establish that peace that they're longing for. Sin may seem like a solution, and it might even hope and help momentarily and give some benefit, but in the end, it always enslaves us. The story doesn't have a happy ending. They end up as slaves. Your story is not going to have a happy ending. You are going to end up as a slave. But there is good news. It's not all bad news. We're going to be covering some of that good news over the next couple of weeks and the next couple of stories when we look at Moses and we look at God's delivering them out of Egypt. But I wanted to give you that window to remind you that God's got a plan to deliver you too. And that's the story. But in order to receive that good news, you have to hear that bad news. I didn't listen to you, God, and I got myself in a mess. And I'm just like a slave. My sin is the master. My family is broken, and I don't see any way out. Everything I do just seems to make it worse. And there's that good news that God says, I got this. I can redeem you, and I can set you free. We're going to have a hymn of